No, only release it. I can't write. Existe uma also a good space. Sounds a good share. Framework completely different.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this lecture on Brazil's new industrial policy, Nova Indústria Brasil. A couple of housekeeping notes. There will be free Brazilian snacks and drinks after the lecture upstairs at the Center of Latin American Studies. So please join us for that. And second housekeeping note, I would like to check that everyone online can hear us well. So I will just exit this. And if a brave person online can put a thumbs up if they can hear me loud and clear. We will double check.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thumbs up. Okay, perfect. And you can see the slides as well. Maybe someone else can put a thumbs up. Yes, fantastic. Okay, so we'll go back to this. Okay, so it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Mateus Labrunie. So he's originally from Rio. He completed his PhD with the University of Cambridge Institute for Manufacturing, and he's now a policy analyst at the Institute for Manufacturing Policy Links Department. So without further ado, Mateus, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Just a small correction. I didn't actually my PhD here at the Center of Development Studies with Hajun Chang. But after that, I joined the Institute for Manufacturing just in West Cambridge, where I've been working as a policy analyst. Basically, I have some little bit of slides, but about what we do there. But I just want to say thank you so much. This was supposed to just be a coffee that we were going to have to discuss the diversity and policy. And I asked, well, don't you want to invite other people? And then this came through. So thanks a lot. It's a great initiative. Very happy to talk about this. So just a brief introduction to how I got here. And basically, I did my undergrad and master's in the Federal University of Rio, where I studied already the issues of industrial policies, comparing some industrial policies of different countries. Then, as I mentioned, I did my PhD here with Hajun, and now, since around 2 years ago, I joined the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge Industrial Policy. For those of you who don't know, the Institute for Manufacturing has around 200 researchers. It involves both research, so they have postdocs, PhDs doing research on management, technology, and policy. Some undergrads, postgrads, and PhD masters in education tracks there, and also the practice part, which is where I work, which we work basically doing consultancy for governments and international organizations. And that's how this Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy came to be, this bringing together this research services and network to study industrial and innovation policies. So I've been studying these issues for a long time, and we have done projects in over 20 countries. So this gives us a very good overview of what different countries are doing. So I think this is one of the strengths that we have there, this ability to kind of see things in international comparison perspective. So, moving on to Brazil. And I think the first thing I would like to say is that, well, I see there are a lot of other Brazilians here, and we always hear this thing, right? I mean, growing up, we always hear Brazil is the country of the future, país do futuro, right? And so this is something that has always been behind the back of our heads, but we actually never really see this future arrive. Like, we always think, oh, it's future, so much potential, you hear this all the time. And then at some point it starts becoming something like one of those signs that pops that says, you know, free beer tomorrow. And no matter when you go there, there's always tomorrow, there's always tomorrow. So I would say it's similar with Brazil. It's always like economic development in the future, tomorrow. So, but we never see it. But why? And that's why I'm gonna try to like explore here with you today. Like, what has been the attempts and why maybe they have failed, and is this time different? Is this time with Nova Indústria Brasil going to be different? So just a brief background, because maybe some of you are not from this area of industrial policy. So I'd just like to briefly state what's the kind of current common arguments that you see in the debate. Basically, you have, it's always a very controversial topic. Industrial policy always divides a lot of economists. And basically, you have those that are very against it, that say, no, the government should not be doing it, should not be intervening in market mechanisms. When it does, it just creates inefficiencies, rent-seeking behavior, corruption, etc. They also mentioned that many countries, especially in Latin America and Africa, had industrial policy experiences, but did not develop, especially, you know, the attempts in the 1960s and 70s, known as import substitution industrialization, right? And also it's common to point out some classic industrial policy failures, you know, as in the US, the example of Solyndra is very well known as a classic failure of industrial policy. You have South Korea, the company Shinjin, also billions were put into it, and it failed ultimately. Shipbuilding and computers in the UK. So you can always cherry pick examples of industrial policies that have failed, and they do exist, it fails sometimes. However, on the other hand, you have those that argue for industrial policies, such as myself, basically claiming that no large country has actually developed, caught up with the advanced nations without a very active industrial policy, industrial, technological, commercial policy to support the development of its private sector. There are also arguments of the entrepreneurial state style that claim that many innovations that exist today would not have existed if not for a very thorough support from the government, such as the internet, GPS, drones, etc. This is also very strong arguments made in the debate. Then finally, just like you can cherry pick examples of failed industrial policies, you also have outstanding successes, even in countries that are seen as failures. You know, Brazil even, which I would claim is not really a failure, but even there you have Embraer, and you have Embrapa, you have so many companies that are either were state-owned or were government supported, and that have become huge success examples. In other countries as well, Ethiopian Airlines is commonly cited as a very classic example of success. Okay, so the debate today, I would say it has been converging to a consensus that is not if you should do it, it's more about how you do it, right? So how you should decide on which sectors to support, how you should implement the policies, how you should evaluate and monitor them, etc. Right? So this is more or less the current consensus in the debate. And just also to give you a brief history, I would say this is what Hajun Chang mentioned was the first guy to really do a structured industrial policies within Robert Walpole in the 18th century. Well, actually even before that in the UK, basically structuring protection to the emerging industries and doing government-sponsored poaching of skilled artisans from Flanders, and all that stuff. But later in the 19th century, you have Alexander Hamilton in the US is a classic founding father of industrial policy with his report on the subject of manufacturers, and Friedrich List, which learned about it in the US and brought it back to Germany to implement this type of policies there, what we would call the national system of political economy. In the 20th century, it was more the so-called developing countries that really started doing industrial policy very strongly. And here, the classic example of success is the East Asian development experiences, right? So I put here just General Park Chung-hee from South Korea and Lee Kuan-yew from Singapore, which are the kind of leaders of these development experiences in the region, right? And today, I would say, well, China, of course, since the opening up by Deng Xiaoping and continuing now on the similar path with Xi Jinping are, have never stopped doing industrial policy with all these 5-year plans and everything and state planning. And now even the US which also has never stopped doing it, but now is explicitly saying it will do it, it's committing unprecedented budget to it. So I put also there Joe Biden as an example of this kind of rebirth of industrial policy, right? And what about Brazil? So going more specifically here, so just to give you a brief historical overview, I would say the industrialization experience of Brazil really started in the 1930s and 40s. So right after the First World War, when the supply chains were broken up, and so industrialization spontaneously started in Brazil, especially in the 1920s. And then in the 1930s and 40s, you had this very strong state, it was a dictatorship at the time, which came with this idea of national developmentalism, state-led industrialization, and import substitution industrialization, really driving industry forward in Brazil. In the 1950s, you have Juscelino Kubitschek, 1955 actually, which was a different type of developmentalism, which abandoned the national developmentalism focus and was more open to foreign capital, to multinationals. So it has this idea of the tripod of foreign capital, national capital, and national private capital and national public capital as things that should be brought together to support this development effort. Then you had military dictatorship from 64 to 85 in Brazil. And I would say Brazil was, well, hard to say that about the dictatorship, but it was lucky that the dictatorship was not neoliberal as it was in other countries, such as Chile, Argentina. There they were actually developmentalists. So they kept investing in Brazilian industries, protecting, etc., although highly reliant on foreign debt. And that was what led to big problem, not only in Brazil, in the whole Latin America and whole Africa countries were very indebted. And then in 1979, you had the interest rate shock, and every country that was highly indebted had the so-called debt crisis, right? And that led to the lost decade in the 1980s in Latin America and Africa and etc. So in the 1980s and 90s is the Washington Consensus era of liberalization, etc. And it was no different in Brazil. And so I would just like to highlight that you can also see this periodization very clearly if you look at manufacturing as a share of GDP in Brazil. You see an increase up from the data here goes back to 1947 up until 1983, 85, which is around the time of the debt crisis and inflationary pressures, and then it's basically downhill from there, right? And even if you had some attempts at industrial policy in the 2000s, which I'll discuss later, you can still see that they were basically unable to revert this downward trend in the manufacturing as a share of GDP, right? So I'll just go very briefly through here because Brazil did have some industrial policy experiences in the 2000s. First one called the Industrial Technological and Foreign Trade Policy, PTC. Then you had the Productive Development Plan, with the PIT. and finally the Brasil Maior plan in 2011. Right, so these were like the big national strategies that were attempted there. They all had horizontal and vertical, well, sectoral axis, right? They all tried to improve the business environment. They all created R&D, tax breaks, and all these things. But they also all had vertical attempts. So they chose industries that they wanted to develop. In the case of the first one, it was highly focused on semiconductors, software, capital goods, and pharma and drugs. So it was reasonably contained. It chose 4 or 5 sectors. But if you go, you see, it seems that as it went through, it started losing focus. So for example, in the PDP, you had 25 priority sectors. And of course, if you have 25 priority sectors, it means you have no priority sectors. And the same happened in the Brasil Maior plan. And it was funny reading, like preparing for this, what was the focus, and you see it. Mechanical, electronic, health, scale intensive, labor intensive, agro industry, commerce, logistics. That's the entire economy, right? So it's like an economic plan, not even another policy. And in terms of policy instruments, you have all the classic tax incentives, subsidies, public procurement, skills development, etc., etc. So, you know, all of these were kind of similar in some sense. And I'll try to show a bit what is similar also in this one. And what can we see is probably some new things that we haven't seen before. Right? But just to complement what I mentioned before, not only was these policies were unable to revert the manufacturing as a share of GDP, but also if you look at the share of different types of products in the export basket, the ones that grew the most were natural resource based and commodities, right? And meanwhile, products, so like scale intensive, so all the differentiated science-based products, everything, they grew, they still had a deficit, right? So this is what we call the reprimarization of the Brazilian economy, or other technical term is the regressive specialization of the Brazilian economy, right? So this period here is seen as and we reprimarized the Brazilian economy despite these attempts at industrial policy, right? So as the economist rightly puts there, you know, Brazil was taking off. This is in 2009, and as they blatantly put it in 2013, things had collapsed. And then, you know, what explains? This is a very big debate. I won't, of course, be able to explain. I don't even know if I can explain it, but some well-known issues that caused this was first, as I mentioned, this lack of focus. They were not very targeted, these policies, except for the first one, which was relatively short-lived. But also one thing that industry is very keen to always mention is that the macroeconomic conditions of Brazil is hostile to industrial activity. What does that mean? Exchange rates were overvalued, so that is not good for the exporters because their products become more expensive in the external market. Interest rates, one of the highest in the world. It's always like Brazil and Turkey, like the highest interest rates, they compete, or the real interest rates. And so if you discount inflation already. So how do you justify doing an industrial project, which is capital intensive, which takes a long time to mature? You can just put your money in the bank and get 10, 12% a year just by sitting on your money risk-free. You know? So it's very difficult to justify this with very high interest rates. Also, fiscal regime in Brazil, quite difficult to, quite strict. Especially, I will talk a bit about teto de gastos, you know, the expenditure ceiling that came afterwards. But even in this period, you have this primary surplus policy that in Brazil, you have to do a primary surplus, you know. So that's primary means before you pay the interest rate. So all of this makes it very difficult for the government to do meaningful industrial policy as well. Custo Brasil, this is also something Brazil cost, is highly always mentioned by industry as well. Poor quality of the infrastructure, the tax structure, tax system, which is inefficient, complicated. Companies spend the most amount of hours in the world to pay taxes, and sometimes they get fined and they get bad. So all of this always mentioned as part of the cost of doing business in Brazil. And finally, I'll just mention two things in the international environment. One was that during this period, the world was still kind of in love with the idea of offshoring, outsourcing things to China and everything, and to Asia and more generally. And so Brazil, Latin America, and Africa, were not in the map of companies when they decided through their location decisions, right? Some did, some came, some have some investment in Brazil, but most were going to consider. Right? And at the same time, industrial policy was not well seen. So all of these things that they were doing, it was against what the recommendations of international organizations, the recommendations of other countries. It was kind of a bad thing to do industrial policy at that time, right? And then came 2015, 2022, what I'm calling neoliberal governments part 2. And then it was, I'm just giving two examples here of things that I think are very significant. The first one is the reduction in science and technology funding. So if you see from 2015 to 2020, it's like almost half the investment in science and technology. And if you look also at BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank funding from also 2014 onwards, kind of like to a fraction of what it was. So it was really governments that were trying to reduce the participation of the government in the economy, right? They saw the government shouldn't be doing these things. The NDS, they were trying to pitch it as a bank of services, so just a bank to support the Brazilian destatization efforts. So anyway, the results, if we were already like spinning around like crazy, the economists once again very unhingedly put it became an oxygen mask, and so what was already going a bit out of shape became like a pretty bad situation, right? And then here we are, Nova Indústria Brasil. And it comes as the third mandate of the Lula, of the Workers' Party president, which was the one that had done the same policy before. And now it's basically a new attempt at an industrial policy in Brazil. So what is this new industrial policy? First of all, just to give you a sense of what are the ambitions, the objectives here, right? The overall ambition is to revert Brazil's premature deindustrialization and achieve what they're calling neo-industrialization. What is that? No clue. No one explained it. They just stated in the documents. That's it. They live with it. Like literally, if you look at the word neo-industrialization, it's just like used. Like, yeah, it's a word that everyone knows it. Yeah. So, but yeah, some critics say, oh, it's because neoliberal industrialization. But anyway, and then in terms of something that's different here is that they are not really targeting sectors, but they are targeting missions, right? Very common also in the debate now, mission-oriented policies that you see, as you probably know. So the missions that they are targeting are sustainable and digital agro-industrial supply chains, mainly for food security. And the agro-industrial complex here. You have the healthcare industrial complex, also as a mission there to support healthcare well-being of the population. You have infrastructure, sanitation, housing, mobility, so all the more infrastructure side of things, but with the sustainable green. You have digital transformation of industry, the industrial digitalization as also an objective. Bioeconomy, decarbonization, and energy transition and security. So here's the more specific sustainability, green sectors, you know. And finally, national security and sovereignty, which is also something very common in this new wave of industrial policy around the world. In terms of budget, this is already something quite surprising. Usually the previous ones didn't really state explicitly or wasn't that much money. So here they stated from the start, we have 300 billion, $60 billion until 2026, so a relatively short time frame to spend on this, which will be more or less broken down in credit, 270, grants, 20, and equity, 8 billion, right? The policy instruments are more or less the same old: subsidized credit, subsidies, tax incentives, equity. They are stating more explicitly, they will buy shares from companies and things like that. Local content requirements, tariff reductions of certain products, and et cetera, but we'll go a bit more into what I think are the more interesting things there. So in terms of implementation, I don't know how familiar you are with Brazilian innovation system or just organizations in general, but in terms of the direction and oversight, they recreated the National Council for Industrial Development, CNDI, or as they say in Brazil, Conselhão, which brings together industry, syndicates, unions, representatives, and representatives from the civil society, from everything. Everyone gets a seat on the table to discuss what they think would be good for industrial policy. And then in terms of execution, you have BNDES, Brazilian National Development Bank, FINEP, which is the Brazilian Innovation Agency, and Embrapi, which is the Brazilian Company of Industrial Innovation, Research in Industrial Innovation. In terms of, so these are the main ones that are delivering the programs for this policy, but you also have SENAI, which is the Industrial Learning System. Basically, that's the one that does worker training for industry in Brazil. SEBRAE, which is the Small and Medium Enterprise Services Organization. And as a monitoring and evaluation of the policy, you have ABDI, which is the Brazilian Industrial Development Agency. So overall, I'd say Brazil actually is quite well served in terms of institutional structure, institutional environment, innovation system, right? Brazil has a pretty strong and well-established innovation system, which these agencies like BNDES is from the 1950s, you know, and so this, I would say, is a differential of Brazil compared to other developing countries, you know, like Argentina would die to have BNDES, you know, but they simply don't have the institutional structure that Brazil has for that. But it's good to keep in mind also the relative size of these things, right? Because you look, they're like, oh, they're more or less the same, right? But actually, like Brazil, BNDES is a behemoth, right? It's gigantic. It's probably the second largest development bank in the world, only behind the World Bank, something like that. It's like huge. FINEP, which is also quite big, 25 billion in assets. And then the other ones are quite small, like you see there, they split this very little thing here. So SENAI, Embrapi, and ABDI, they're very much smaller. Although in Embrapi, I must say, they are small. I think they have something like 36 full-time employees, but they work by leveraging existing infrastructures. So they work, for example, Brazil has research centers and innovation institutes. And Embrapi just kind of gives money to these centers, these institutes, and leverages the research that happens there already. So, you know, this is kind of, that's why I put an asterisk there. It's bigger than that, really, but still it's not as big than that. Sorry for the very text-heavy slide here, but I couldn't find a way to really summarize this. But I just wanted to show that some of the main kind of programs that Nova Indústria Brasil is doing, and they are clustered around indústria mais produtiva, more productive industry, indústria mais inovadora, digital, more innovative and digital industry, indústria mais exportadora, more exporting, and greener industry. Right? So these are the big 4 areas there of where the money is being split to. I will just highlight the ones that I put in bold there, because Brasil Mais Produtivo is actually a very interesting program run by both Senai and Sebrae, which I mentioned are these two here, the industrial learning system and the small and medium enterprise service. And what it does is basically it goes to companies it brings like actually innovation agents to companies and stays with the company for like 5 months and does a whole diagnostic of the company and do technical assistance to the company to implement digitalization solutions and train the workforce and blah, blah, blah. So it's really interesting program. It's quite big. It's just in São Paulo. They were doing like 10,000 companies a year. And they have been achieving really impressive results, like average of 60% productivity improvements and things like that. Yeah, it's a really, really impressive program. I studied a bit it when I was doing my PhD, and they decided to expand it. So I think that's great. And now they are also doing credit and grants on top of these technical services. They will also give company the money that they might need to acquire these solutions, digital solutions, or lean. It's usually lean, lean production, like making the company more efficient, just using better management practices and stuff. And digital solutions, so digitalizing the machines and connectivity and etc. Right? So anyway, very interesting program. This one, if I understood correctly, is just kind of an expansion of the BNDES and FINEP's innovation funding, because FINEP especially has a lot of innovation credit for companies that have innovative projects and stuff. So it's basically just leveraging what these organizations were already doing. And then you start having some new stuff. So this National Fund for Industrial and Technological Development is something new. We don't know if you know, but Brazil has the National Fund for the Development of Science and Technology at BNDES, which is the money that FINEP uses to do its programs. And now they want to develop a similar fund, smaller, but a fund for industrial and technological development. So it would be more focused on companies, and building innovation in companies, and less on the science part, more on the innovation, really commercialization side of things, right? They want to create a BNDES X index, so export import bank, which I thought was interesting. I couldn't find much more information on this, but it would be nice. And also this Fundo Clima, so a new fund focused specifically on climate, environmental, sustainability. And one of the areas of this fund would be making industry more sustainable. So decarbonization efforts, energy efficiency, all this kind of stuff, right? And you have some other stuff you can have a look in your own time. I won't spend much time on this. How is it advancing so far, right? Because if it's up to 2026, it means it's a quite short time frame. So they gotta be doing stuff already. And I was pleased to find that they are, and they already spent like 28% of the 300 million. They mainly because they were already spending it before they published the policy. But hey, they're well on their way. And so basically they have already spent that, and mainly through FINEP, and then that's operations. And I had a look in, and they're doing projects with companies like Volkswagen, Embraer, some pharmaceutical and medicine companies, Hyper and Alta. Oh, that's not right. That's WEG, no WEG. It's a professional deformation. And Positivo, which is a IT company, Brazilian computer company. 670 projects already approved by FINEP. 11 public calls for grants from FINEP. This is quite big because when I was doing my PhD, in the last 5 years they did 2. So like just last year they did 11. So last year this year. So you can see they're really expanding. And Embraer is also going to use this new fund there. invest around 1 billion. So overall, they're really doing stuff, so which is good. Finally, let me just then, after reading a bit of that, what to me comes out as the new stuff or most interesting stuff. Missionary anthem, I don't find it particularly interesting, but it's new. Some people consider it to be a game changer. Oh, it's the new, it's going to change everything. I don't really see it that way. I just see it as interesting to keep, grounded. Okay, what are you doing your industrial policy for? Okay, because ultimately it needs to improve society and well-being of people, and it's not just money for the companies, So it's interesting to have these things there, but you still need the sectoral technological side of things, and so you're just shaping it in a different way. One thing that I thought also is quite interesting here is the change in the interest rate that they're using for these projects. So, for example, the credit lines of BNDES Internet, now instead of using TJLP, the long-term interest rate, which was around 7%, you're gonna use now the reference rate, which is 2%. And this is a massive difference if you think about your company. You're thinking if you can justify the project, your innovation project, if it has to give 7% return a year, you're not gonna do it. You're gonna put your money in the bank. You can earn more than that, and. But if it's 2%, oh, okay, that's especially because it's compounded. So I think this can potentially have very, very, big impacts. One thing that I thought was really interesting as well was this letras de crédito de desenvolvimento. So one thing that Brazil has, I don't really know if this is common, is that you can sell some papers in the financial market to fund specific companies that are subsidized by the government. So you have this for the agriculture sector, and you have this for, I think, real estate. So LCI and LCA, I think. And now they're doing the same for industry. So the financial markets of banks and even people can buy basically these papers that are going to be used to fund companies that are within these government programs. So it's another source of funding basically for the government. It's not the government taking it out of its own pocket. It's the government bringing it to the financial market to capture money and then use that to invest in these companies. Right? So I thought that was also a very interesting instrument. And as I mentioned, there are these new funds, the new Industrial Technological Development Fund, the Climate Fund, and this, and they're also a Critical Minerals Fund. Okay, so they're not super big, but they're not negligible, like 1 billion, it's like 200 million. So, some interesting instruments as well. In terms of monitoring, in Brazil is very bad at monitoring policies and evaluation and this kind of thing. So one thing that I thought was interesting is that ABDI, the Brazilian Industrial Development Agency, is looking to create this industrial development observatory to evaluate how these policies are being implemented, etc. But this one, I really haven't seen it yet. I'm not sure how developed it is, so maybe this will not happen. And as I said, the Exim Bank. But as I very subtly put here, you can see that what I think is different this time is not these things. These things are nice. They may have a difference, especially the interest rate. But what I think is really different here is the different context in which this policy is being developed and implemented. Right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But just before I move to that, I would like just to make a side note that this policy is being done in parallel to what is known as the Novo PAC. Brazilians here are probably familiar with that. PAC is the Growth Acceleration Program. It's basically the government's infrastructure investment program, right? And for obvious reasons, this has a very big synergy with industrial policy. So it's actually much larger than the Nova Indústria Brasil, as because infrastructure investments are super capital intensive, right? So it's $250 billion more or less. And across all these areas, transportation, cities, healthcare, science and technology, water, connectivity, etc., etc., etc. So just put some highlights here that you have transportation, cities, energy transition and security, and digital inclusion and connectivity. There's a lot of money also being put in developing these infrastructures. So yeah, just something to keep in mind there. That's also happening at the same time, more or less. So moving on to global context. The first big difference, I would say, is that while in the 2000s, the policies, as I said, were done in this context that saw them as bad things that shouldn't be done, now the world's in a different stage. And industrial policy is back, as you can see by many international organizations claiming that everyone now that never studied industrial policy in their lives are claiming to be experts in it. And some defend it, some people in the IMF, some people in the US, but some people still consider it a bad idea. So it's not everyone that's buying into it. There are still some people, but they are mostly being discredited, in my humble opinion. So you have all these policies going on in the world, and some of them are huge. So of course I could not talk about this without talking about, for example, the Chips and Science Act in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act. And also in the EU, you have this European Green Deal, European Chips Act, which is also massive, So this, I think, is a big difference, is that now advanced economies are doing industrial policy super explicitly with no shame. And even more than developing economies, as some people that have been trying to quantify industrial policies have pointed out, they are actually being done much more by developed countries than by developing ones nowadays. And here, just to show you a bit of the difference in scale of things, right? Just the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act are like much, much bigger than the Brazilian policy. The European Green Deal is about 10 times bigger. Or you may be thinking, oh yeah, but it's not fair to compare. European unions. There are many countries. There are a big economy. So I always like to show a bit of this graph. That well, actually, Brazil is like a continental country, and even in terms of population, it's similar even to higher population than Western Europe. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about changing the production structure of a country of this size with this money, whereas they've got this amount of money. So the competition is very tough. So even though industrial policies are now well accepted, you're also competing much more thoroughly in them. Okay? Finally, nearshoring, I think, is also something that's highly mentioned as this context that we're living right now. Like companies and governments around the world are talking about, especially after COVID, after these armed conflicts that are going on, everyone wants to make their supply chain more resilient. So they want to bring production closer to their own countries or even reshore production. So you have, a lot of companies going to Mexico, US companies going to Mexico, for example. European Parliament publishing reports saying we need to bring back industries back to Europe. Or to nearshore them at least, right? And then also you can call it green shoring or however you want to call it, but basically this idea that companies and governments are looking more and more to make their production more sustainable. And one way of doing that is locating them in countries that are somewhat greener. And Brazil, just to give you some example, it's kind of ahead of this in this race somehow because it has a really good electricity matrix. So it's mainly hydropower, but also has very strong wind and solar energy generation. And it also has big potential to increase this even further, right? So here is the potential for solar photovoltaics, right? So solar power and wind in Brazil is like among the highest in the world. And also green hydrogen, right? Which is this new potential source of energy, potential fuel, right? Conversion of energy, renewable energy into a type of fuel that could be produced at one of the lowest prices, lowest costs in Brazil and also Chile. So you know, so not only right now it's already ahead of the race, it also has one of the highest potentials to be super sustainable green in terms of energy, of renewable energy at least. And what about the national context? One thing that I will point out that I think is extremely important is that what I said about the macroeconomic context being hostile to industry in the 2000s. And here, I will say that it's improved a bit and quite significantly in some aspects. For example, the exchange rate, right? In the 2000s, this is where the exchange rate level was around 2-1. Everybody traveling the world, you know, it was very, very good for tourism, but terrible for industry exporters, right? Because your product becomes much more expensive in the foreign market. And this is where it is since around 2019. And it seems to be staying there, you know? So before especially this was highly driven by commodity prices going up in Brazil, exporting things, and they just let the exchange rate overvalue. But right now they seem to be being good at managing it so that it stays at that level. I'm not a macroeconomist, so I don't know exactly what they're doing to keep it there, but seems to be at a reasonable level at that time. Interest rates are still high, and I don't see this changing. It's how the system is done. That's how the central bank operates. So, yeah, I think it's just something you have to deal with. But some other things I think were reasonably positive. One was that the expenditure ceiling, which was since around 2015, which didn't even allow the government to spend more than the previous year plus inflation. So it didn't even account for population growth, for example. The government could not spend more even just because its population growth. So it was like an aberration. No one does it like this in the world, but we were doing it. So at least they abolished that and they put this new fiscal rule that's a bit more lenient, although still quite strict. But it allows you to do a bit more policies just because you have more spending space. And finally, the tax reform that was just done. Apparently, it was quite good, especially to reduce cost of production. So remember, I said the tax structure in Brazil is very complicated, complex. They passed reform recently and made it a bit more efficient, especially for production. So, you know, overall, seems to be a different and improved macroeconomic environment. In terms of policymaking capacity, however, I think we have a big gap here because the legacy, I would say, of this second round of neoliberal governments was a reduction and an erosion of the Brazilian civil service, the servidores públicos, because they were not hiring new people, basically. So just to give you an example, this is FINEP, the innovation agency staff. And you can see that since 2013, 14, they've been, it's basically just people retiring and they're not hiring new people. You know? So, and some big layoffs that happened like here and here. So, you know, then this is just, this is just one agency, but I think this is more of a general trend that was happening in the Brazilian government in general. But luckily, we have Sidgwick, who is the new Minister of Management and Innovation in Public Services. And this was a ministry basically created to revert this kind of reduction and erosion of Brazilian government capacity. And what are they doing? Basically, they're doing national test for the public services. It's gonna hire 6,680 positions for 21 public organizations. For Brazilians, it's been called a name governo, right? Like that. So people it was just postponed because of the tragedy that's happening now in the southern state of Brazil. But yeah, but it's gonna happen soon. So it might help to fix this gap that was happening before. In terms of political conditions, then we start the mess. And I think as Brazilians here will agree, there are some things that are still highly unstable and difficult to manage. But you have this, in my view, you have this contrast between the executive, so the Workers' Party, which is quite progressive and wants to do all these different things, and you have a very conservative legislative power. Of course, in Brazil, you have the Centrão, the big parties in the middle that go to whatever party is in power, really. So that gives it a bit of governability, I would say. But still, I think it's something that makes it potentially unstable politically. And then you have this issue of the politically active judiciary, which in my view is for good and for bad, right? Because on one hand, you have a guy like Alison, which is a Supreme Court judge who's been very active in fighting against the attacks on democracy that happened in Brazil. You know, our version of the Capitol in the US, like people just invaded the government buildings and started breaking things. And on the bad side, you also have figures such as Sérgio Moro, who has, well, at least in my view, some of you might have a different view, but who did some very arbitrary judicial projects that can be classified as lawfare against the Workers' Party. So all of this, I think, creates this policy continuity problem, because if a policy as ambitious as Nova Indústria Brasil is to be successful, it cannot just last 3-4 years. You don't change a whole country's production structure in 3-4 years. You need 10-20 years for that to happen. And you need for it to continue throughout that period. If you start changing governments and still changing the policy, it's not going to happen. It's not going to be successful. So how do you really achieve this policy continuity? If you look at the historical experience, that tells you a lot, because the countries that were able to actually change their production structure had super stable political systems that were able to have the same policy or improvements of the policy for 20-30 years, right? So, and then we have the issue, oh yeah, sorry, just for you that don't know, Alexandre Moraes, also known as Xandão. But, you know, you have Lula, who, although he keeps posting that he's healthy, he's fit, and, you know, although even he made a big hit on the internet with this amazing guy. Even though he is like very, very fit and he keeps talking about it, even like he's quite old, you know, he's like 78. And my view is that if you have to talk about it, if you have to post these things, it's like that guy that, you know, is trying to appear that he's young. So that to me is already a sign that you know, yeah, he's old and he's not going to be around forever. So how do we make sure that this it will be continued, you know? So it is actually an issue, and of course you have some new figures that they're trying to build, like Haddad, that would like to continue this, but it creates a lot of uncertainty. So we just don't know what's going to happen next, right? So I've been talking too much. I will close just by trying to here give you some reasons why I think we can be optimistic about this, and some reasons why I think we should be cautious about it. So on the optimistic side, I would say that it is a well-designed policy, at least from this brief analysis that I made of it. And it's been very cleverly mobilizing many of the institutional assets that Brazil has, which, as I said, is a privilege for a developing country to have so many well-established, well-funded institutions. And have some also interesting new policy instruments that could be also potentially transformational. You have more policy space in that sense, so industrial policy is now more accepted internationally. You have better macroeconomic conditions, in my view. And you also have potentially companies that would like to come to Brazil based on this issue of nearshoring and greenshoring. But on the other hand, you have, as I mentioned, strong competition with other countries. China is growing, it's taking market in virtually every sector from other countries, and now US and Europe are joining because they don't want to lose against China. And so this is the fight that Brazil is getting into. You know? It's joining well, I wouldn't say it's actually competing at the same level as these guys. Like the world doesn't see Brazil as a threat at all. But you know, this is the environment that we're in. As I mentioned, challenges to policy continuity. For me, this is probably the biggest one, because if you stop it in 2-3 years, that's it. Doesn't make any difference. As I mentioned, policy capacity. So rebuilding this policy making capacity in Brazil, and all the coordination issues that you need to do to implement all the things that I said. The agencies need to coordinate, to talk to themselves, to between each other, right? And finally, I couldn't leave out the fact that even if you do the best industrial policy in the world, it's still not certain that it will work, because you're going to go to the market, you know, and you're going to have to compete with other companies, and who knows who's going to win, you know? Sometimes you can be. There are many things that determine if you win or lose in a market, and industrial policy can just address some of them. A lot of it is also the private sector, if it's able to run efficiently, to create new products, new innovations that the market wants. So there is an inherent uncertainty to innovation and to industrial policy in general. And if it starts failing at the beginning, maybe it loses political backing, then it stops, you know. So it's difficult to predict what's going to happen, but let's remain reasonably optimistic, but also reasonably cautious about it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So I would like to invite questions from the audience. So first of all, I think we'll prioritize. I'll give a prompt to people online, because we'll be holding our snacks upstairs. So any other questions can go on upstairs. But I will encourage those from our audience online to put any questions in the chat, and we can ask them. I see no questions just now, so we'll go back to the audience. You had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone, great presentation. My name is Emiliano, and I want to ask you to speak a bit more. You mentioned that some of the new funds were interesting in that I didn't understand where you said they, instead of funds coming from the state's pockets, they're doing something else. And the context for this question is that I've been studying how some South American countries in the past have tried to implement a green industrial policy. And in the case of Ecuador, for example, the funding for a green industrial policy came from oil extraction. So my broader question is, what is the relationship between these industrial policies that Brazil is implementing and its dependency on petrol industries?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Yeah. I think the climate fund, in the Clima, basically it draws money from several sources, including part of it is from oil revenue, oil royalties, and yeah. So it is a combination of public money straight from the union, money from Petrobras and and just like oil activities in general, and I think there, or was it? There were some other, like, it's a combination of different, maybe it's private sector, I don't remember. Maybe it's BNDES, I think BNDES himself is putting money in the climate, because this fund is gonna be managed by BNDES. And so I think it's also some of it is on BNDES money. So overall, I think they have this idea of like trying to take some of the surplus from oil to make it into something kind of a green transition or something like that. However, and about the other one that you mentioned of the non-state funded things, source of funding, basically. It's this letras de crédito do desenvolvimento, which is something new, and it's quite interesting, I thought, which is basically just government will create a new financial tool, financial instrument, which is these papers that can be sold to private organizations in the market. And this money is used to fund the industrial companies that they are supporting. This already exists for agriculture, and it already exists for real estate, and so they're just applying the same structure to industrial companies, which is, I think, quite clever. Yeah, I don't know if it's
The credit guarantee.
No, credit guarantee. I think it's more when you kind of the state guarantees the loan that the companies take, right? This is different. This is private money. It's just the state is just kind of creating these new papers that will be sold in the market, and it's like equity basically. But instead of for specific companies, it's a fund for the whole pool of companies that they are supporting. So yeah, it's an interesting tool. I recommend to read a bit about it. But the bigger question about the dependence on natural resources and oil, like Petrobras is still the biggest company in Latin America, and that's still the biggest sector in Brazil. And are we going to move away from that or not? And I don't think there's anything clear in that sense in this policy that's like one of the goals. But to be honest, like even if we are decarbonizing and reducing our reliance on oil, oil will still be there, like even if to produce plastics and petrochemicals and things like that. So yeah, the decoupling has to be slow and gradual, at least that's my view. So yeah, I think that's also what they're doing.
Thanks. Great.
We have had a question come through online. Tim Page asks, I'm interested that trade unions as well as companies help to shape the new industrial policy. How big an issue is good work? You mentioned the focus on productivity, innovation, and green industry, but is fear of a loss of good, productive manufacturing jobs for low skill, low value work an issue in Brazil like it is in Europe?
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Thanks a lot. Glad to see you're watching the lecture. But this is actually a point of criticism to this policy. I've seen some people criticizing because the workers, even though there are some unions, some workers organizations in the National Council, the main ones that are really shaping it are the so-called patronal, like from the companies, like the representatives of the companies, the industry associations, and so this is a point of criticism. I don't know what's the sweet spot there, how much of the workers' voice you need, how much of the company's voice you need. Is a 50-50 balance the best or not? I don't really have an answer to that. But I think this policy doesn't address this issue of decent work, as ILO says, as explicitly. Like maybe in some parts of it does mention that, but it's not the focus of it. It's more of a industrial, like traditional industrial policy in that sense. Worried more about competitiveness, productivity, and this kind of stuff. But yeah, but I guess this would be maybe more addressed in other policies of the Workers' Party, you know, they have this pluriannual plans and all this other complementary policies to the labor market and say social policies that maybe address this issue more directly. But yeah, it's not definitely not, at least I didn't see it as a main topic in this policy. Yeah.
You mentioned one of the tools was through regulation.
Hmm.
Do you have a bit more information on it? What is the plan? How is regulation going to help that? I mean, I'm not an economist, so
Okay. Yeah.
but I am a regulator, so
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
I'm quite interested in.
I mean, there are some things, I think, especially on the green side of things, that they are working a lot on, and they do mention them. I just didn't focus on it so much with this presentation. I was more like, where's the money? But basically, yes, they have a lot of like very strong regulatory effort that's going on at the same time.
Right.
This, I think, especially on the digital and the green, right? So both for
It needs to get a right balance. I mean, we are right now in the middle of days with, for instance, the AI Act in Europe. You know, the bar is very high, and how does that work with innovation? And obviously, you know, you have to protect people. So, you know, it's a difficult balance act. And I'm just wondering, what's the Brazilian policy on this?
Yeah, no, I can't answer that. I really don't know. Yeah.
But it is an
it
interesting
I
thing
think
to perhaps I will look into this a bit more.
Yeah, no, and as I said, like, there is a lot going on. I saw something, but I'm not a regulator, so I was like, okay, I don't know what this means. So like, but there are some interesting things that we're doing in this context. So yeah, I recommend going, but yeah, just have a focus on this.
But they have net zero targets.
Yes. I don't know much more about it,
Okay.
but yeah, they have decarbonization, energy efficiency targets, and this kind of thing, yeah.
By law.
I think so, yeah, I think so. I mean, the plan has it. But I'm really speaking outside of my comfort zone here, and yeah, but good point, I'll look more into it. I mean, this is just my first go at this, you know, I hope to improve it over time. So yeah, that's definitely a point worth exploring more.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? There are no more online. So if there are no more questions. I think it's not done.
Hold on.